The picture emerging from southern Lebanon is no longer the picture Israeli officials promised at the beginning of this campaign. What was supposed to look like control now looks, at least according to parts of Israel's own press, like entrapment, and that matters. Because when even conservative Israeli newspapers begin describing the northern front as a quagmire, the story is no longer just about battlefield friction, it becomes a story about strategic miscalculation. Let me walk you through why this matters. Over the past several days, a cluster of reports, ambush footage, battlefield claims, and unusually blunt commentary from Israeli media have all pointed in the same direction. Hezbollah remains active in southern Lebanon, is still capable of coordinated guerrilla operations, and has not been neutralized in the way Israeli political messaging suggested. And that is the thesis. And it is not coming only from Arab or Iranian outlets. One of the most striking examples came from Marandi, a major Israeli newspaper with a conservative reputation and no history of serving as a platform for Hezbollah narratives. In an analysis that caused visible discussion, the paper reportedly described the situation in northern Israel and across the Lebanese front in terms that can only be called alarming. Its core message was simple. The Israeli army is sinking into the Lebanese mire. That phrase matters because it is not the language of victory management. It is the language of a military operation that has lost its clean lines, lost its tempo, and may be losing the public confidence that sustained it. In war, that shift is often more dangerous than a tactical setback. Armies can absorb casualties. Political systems struggle much more when their own population stops believing the campaign is leading anywhere. Marandi went further, according to the reporting cited in the transcript, by stating that dozens or even hundreds of Hezbollah fighters remain present in what is described as the yellow zone of southern Lebanon. More importantly, the paper said they are operating with guerrilla tactics. The implication is clear. Areas many outside observers assumed were under effective Israeli or international oversight still contain organized, hostile networks capable of launching ambushes. That is not a minor detail. It means this is not a case of isolated snipers or a few residual cells hiding in difficult terrain. It suggests a sustained presence, command, discipline, and enough battlefield intelligence to harass or strike Israeli formations even after repeated raids and bombardment in a conflict like this. Persistent local presence is itself a form of power. Another report drew attention for a very different reason. According to the same Israeli media discussion, American flags were being raised in Metula, a settlement on the northern front. Whether every detail of that account is fully verified or not, the symbolism is too sharp to ignore. If residents in that area are indeed displaying American flags as a political signal, the message could be read in several ways. It could reflect a plea for protection, a sign of lost confidence in Israel's own leadership, or an attempt to pressure Washington into deeper involvement. It could even be, as some critics suspect, a media device designed to pull the United States more directly into a theater that is proving harder to control than expected. But whatever the precise motive, the symbolism points to one thing: insecurity. And that is where the supposed ceasefire becomes strategically important. The argument in the transcript is that Washington, despite its overwhelming military weight, is now constrained by diplomatic commitments and by the political costs of further escalation. The White House may not fully control Israeli decision-making, but it is still expected to manage the consequences. That creates a paradox in which the United States is tied to Israel's battlefield choices without having a clean or easy path to intervene on its terms. Israel Hayom, another major outlet closely associated with the Israeli right and often aligned with Likud, reportedly carried a similar warning. Its analysis said it was difficult to assume that current attacks would deter Hezbollah, which was demonstrating greater capability and determination than Israel had expected even before the war. That is a remarkable admission from an outlet not known for softening its position toward Israel's enemies. What does that tell us? It tells us the problem is not a single failed raid or one bad weekend on the frontier. The problem is that Hezbollah appears, in these accounts, to have been underestimated at the level of strategic planning. And once that happens, every subsequent tactical problem becomes harder to solve. Because the original assumptions are already broken, this is where the political cost begins to accumulate. If a government promises that an incursion will crush an adversary, restore deterrence, and make border communities safe, then every new ambush becomes more than a military event. It becomes an indictment of the promise itself. In the Israeli domestic arena, where security credibility is central to political survival, that kind of erosion is dangerous. The reports also point to a broader loss of freedom of action. Before this stage of the conflict, Israel often operated across the Lebanese theater with relative confidence, conducting bombardments and cross-border actions while maintaining escalation control. The warning now coming from sections of its own press is that this freedom is narrowing. Israel can neither advance cleanly nor withdraw without risk. That is the essence of a quagmire. A powerful military enters with a superior arsenal, superior air power, and superior intelligence coverage. But the local adversary refuses to collapse. Instead, the local adversary fragments, adapts, waits, and attacks where the stronger army is most exposed. That is not a commentary on hardware alone. It is the classic logic of asymmetric warfare. And here is what many outside the region still fail to grasp. Lebanon is not Gaza, and Hezbollah is not Hamas. The terrain is different, the political structure is different, the military experience is different, and the external support networks are different. Hezbollah has had years to prepare for exactly this kind of conflict. It knows the terrain better than any external force ever could. It has developed hardened local intelligence, decentralized operating methods, and a political ideological framework that allows it to absorb punishment without immediately dissolving. This is why bombs alone rarely resolve such confrontations. Air power can devastate infrastructure, kill commanders, and impose severe costs, but it does not automatically destroy an entrenched movement whose organizational logic is built around attrition, local support, and ideological endurance. At this point, it is important to be precise. None of this means Hezbollah has won the war in any final or simple sense. These conflicts rarely produce clean winners, but it does suggest that Israel may have lost the ability to dictate the tempo, and that is often the first sign that the balance of power is beginning to shift over the longer term. There's also a domestic social layer to this. The transcript draws a sharp distinction between Israelis living in ordinary urban settings and the more ideological settler base tied to expansionist projects. The argument is that those who moved into highly militarized frontier or contested areas often did so under the belief that the state could permanently secure and expand those zones. If that belief breaks down, the consequences are larger than one village or one outpost. The state's promise of security, subsidy, and permanence begins to look fragile. And when residents in those areas no longer believe they are safer after the operation than before it, the entire political narrative of strategic control starts to unravel. That is why the line reportedly cited from Israeli media is so revealing. The current situation in the north is worse than before the war with Iran. Whether one agrees with every comparison or not, the point is unmistakable. The campaign has not yet produced a more secure strategic environment. If anything, it has multiplied fronts, multiplied vulnerabilities, and deepened public anxiety. Now, stay with me, because the military side of the story became even more intense with the wave of drone attacks and ambush reports that followed. According to the account in the transcript, a swarm of explosive drones struck Israeli positions in a highly coordinated sequence. The attacks were not described as random fire. They were presented as phased operations designed to damage equipment, hit responding troops, and then target evacuation elements. One of the central incidents involved an Israeli Merkava tank that had reportedly been disabled. Video circulating online, though not shown in full on many major platforms for obvious reasons. Allegedly captured Israeli soldiers attempting repairs or regrouping around the vehicle before drones began striking the area. The claim is that the attack did not stop there. The next phase reportedly targeted the rescue effort. According to the account, members of Israeli rescue or combat evacuation forces, including personnel associated with Unit 669, came under attack when they moved in to extract casualties. This kind of sequencing matters because it points to planning, surveillance, and a deliberate attempt to exploit the strongest army's rescue reflex. That is not improvisation. That is premeditated battlefield design. First, disable the asset, then hit the cluster that forms around it, then punish the evacuation route or rescue team that arrives under pressure. Anyone who has studied modern drone warfare, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, recognizes the pattern immediately. The transcript also referred to the death of an Israeli sergeant, identified as Aidan Fuchs, reportedly 19 years old and part of an armored brigade. Additional casualties were said to include several wounded, some seriously. As with all rapidly moving battlefield reports, individual details can change as official confirmations emerge, but the broader pattern is what deserves attention. Hezbollah and allied elements appear increasingly able to use low-cost drones to impose direct tactical pain on a technologically advanced force. That is one of the defining military stories of this era. You spend vast sums on armor, sensors, active protection, and layered air defense, and then a relatively cheap drone slips low, maneuvers unpredictably, and detonates at exactly the wrong moment. This is not merely a technical issue, it is a strategic economics problem. The transcript emphasized that many of these were not elite factory perfect systems, but rather improvised or modified drones, comparable in concept to the commercial platforms adapted for combat in other wars. That, too, matters. Because once a non-state actor can weaponize commercially available technology at scale, the barrier to sustained harassment falls dramatically. And when those same drones record their own strikes, the information war becomes inseparable from the battlefield itself. The footage is not just documentation. It is deterrence, propaganda, recruitment, psychological warfare, and strategic signaling all at once. Every clip that spreads online tells local supporters that the resistance is still active and tells the enemy's public that the front is not secure. A further reported strike hit a newly established Israeli artillery bunker in the Al-Bayada area near Tibet. According to Hezbollah-linked reporting, this attack occurred hours before later ambushes, suggesting a broader operational sequence rather than isolated incidents. Mainstream international outlets have not always provided the same level of detail, but the pattern of limited confirmation from the Israeli side, especially concerning evacuations and casualties, has added to the perception that the front is hotter than many external summaries suggest. At the same time, the human toll on civilians continues to grow. The Lebanese Health Ministry, according to the transcript, reported multiple civilian deaths from Israeli bombardments in southern villages, including children. That is the reality that sits underneath every tactical discussion. Both sides claim they are responding to aggression. Both sides describe their actions as necessary, retaliatory, or defensive within their own frameworks. But for civilians in southern Lebanon and northern Israel, the result is the same. Insecurity, grief, displacement, and the constant risk that a local flare-up becomes a regional escalation. The transcript also made a more speculative but strategically interesting point, that something may have changed in Hezbollah's capabilities in recent hours or days. with some military-focused outlets suggesting possible access to more advanced equipment, potentially of Russian origin. That specific claim remains unconfirmed in any definitive public sense, but the timing becomes more notable when placed alongside a major diplomatic event, the reported meeting in Moscow between Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Russian President Vladimir Putin. That brings us to the second major front in this story, and it may be the one with the widest global consequences. While the battlefield in southern Lebanon has intensified, the diplomatic track between Washington and Tehran appears to have collapsed, at least for now, and the failure of that track is not an abstract matter. It affects energy markets, regional deterrence, naval deployments, and the risk of a broader war. According to the transcript, the Trump administration had attempted to arrange high-level contacts with Iran over the weekend of April 25th and April 26th, and the proposed American delegation reportedly included Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, both politically close to Trump, though neither is a conventional career diplomat. The plan, however, fell apart at the last minute. Trump's own explanation, as described in the transcript, was that the Iranian offer was not worth an 18-hour trip, and that internal divisions in Tehran made the situation too confused. But Iranian media reportedly denied that any such meeting had been properly accepted in the first place, and that discrepancy is not a side issue. It suggests either severe miscommunication or an attempt by one side to create the appearance of diplomacy that the other side never intended to validate. If that reading is correct, then the cancellation was not just awkward, it was humiliating. Washington acted as though a meeting was in motion. Tehran acted as though there was no meeting to attend. And then came the most consequential signal of all. Instead of salvaging talks with Washington, Araghchi reportedly traveled to Moscow, where he met directly with Putin. In geopolitical language, that is a very clear message. If the American channel is stalled, Iran has other channels, and those channels lead to major powers. That is not symbolism alone. It changes bargaining leverage. A diplomatically isolated Iran would face pressure to compromise quickly. A Russia-backed and China-connected Iran can afford to wait, absorb pressure, and shift trade routes. The transcript argued exactly that. Iran, in this telling, is practicing strategic patience while Washington is operating on political urgency. Trump needs movement, headlines, and perhaps a visible diplomatic initiative before domestic political costs rise further. Iran does not have the same timetable, and there is a material foundation under that patience. The transcript referred to alternative supply routes that bypass the most visible choke points, including rail movement from Karg Island toward the Caspian system and onward into trade networks connected to Russia and China. Whether every logistical detail is as smooth in practice as in theory is another matter, but the strategic point is correct. Iran is not relying on a single artery if it can avoid doing so. At the core of the diplomatic rupture lies an issue that has haunted the region for decades: the nuclear file. Trump's position, as summarized in the transcript, is straightforward on paper. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran's reply is equally blunt. Its nuclear program is not up for coercive negotiation under current conditions. This is where the trust deficit becomes decisive. Tehran's view, according to the narrative presented, is that there can be no meaningful negotiations while the United States maintains military pressure, freezes Iranian assets, and supports attacks linked to Israel. From that perspective, talks first and relief later is a trap. Relief first and talks later is the minimum entry point. The transcript said Iran had placed 10 demands on the table and was unwilling to move from them. Among those demands, it reportedly wants the release of frozen assets, of compensation for damage, and an end to coercive measures before any serious dialogue proceeds. Whether one agrees with the demands or not, the negotiating posture is unmistakable. Take it or leave it. That creates a deadlock and deadlocks in this region rarely remain purely diplomatic. They spill into tanker routes, air defense postures, militia actions, and market panic. Already, according to the transcript, oil prices in parts of Asian trading have surged into the range of $140 to $150 per barrel, with fears of even higher spikes if maritime disruptions deepen. And that is why this is not only a Middle East story, it is an inflation story. It is a shipping story. It is an electricity bill story. It is a fuel price story. The transcript also argued that many in the public did not fully register the weekend diplomatic collapse because media attention was diverted elsewhere, including a reported shooting scare involving Trump. Whether or not that distraction was intentional is impossible to say here. But it is true that markets can remain briefly detached from strategic reality when headlines are fragmented. Eventually, however, the structure reasserts itself. If Iran will not negotiate on Washington's timetable, if Russia is offering political cover, if the Strait of Hormuz remains vulnerable, and if Israel is under pressure on multiple fronts, and then the cost of denial rises. Energy markets do not care about narrative management forever. There is another layer here that deserves careful attention. The transcript argues that the repeated US and Israeli focus on Iran's nuclear program has had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of deterring Iranian hardline thinking, it may be reinforcing the belief inside Iran that only the possession or credible threshold capability of nuclear arms guarantees respect and prevents direct aggression. That is a dangerous feedback loop. States that already distrust each other begin to internalize the lesson that vulnerability invites attack and that deterrence requires escalation. Whether Iran ultimately crosses any formal threshold is a separate question. The strategic psychology alone is destabilizing enough. The comparison to Israel's undeclared nuclear capacity also remains part of the regional argument. Iranian officials and many outside observers ask the same question. Why is one state's strategic ambiguity tolerated while another state's civilian nuclear infrastructure is treated as inherently illegitimate? That double standard argument has not disappeared. If anything, it has become more deeply embedded in regional diplomacy. The transcript also described Pakistan as a potential intermediary after Qatar reportedly reduced its role. Whether Islamabad can actually bridge the gap is another question. Mediation only works when both sides want a bridge. Right now, the evidence suggests they are standing on opposite banks and using the river itself as a weapon. And then there is the domestic American angle. According to the transcript, support for a broader war is weak, inflation anxiety is already high, and energy instability is politically toxic. If that is true, then Trump faces the worst possible strategic mix: a hard adversary abroad, fragile patience at home, and few credible quick wins in between. That is why the reported emergency meeting in the White House Situation Room matters. You do not call that kind of meeting on a routine basis simply for atmosphere. You call it when the strategic picture is deteriorating faster than the public messaging can keep up. Now, let me address the darkest section of the transcript, because it cannot simply be ignored. A substantial part of the original commentary turned to allegations of torture and sexual abuse of Palestinian detainees in Israeli custody, citing documentation from the Palestinian Center for Human Rights and references to United Nations-linked reporting and other humanitarian sources. These are grave allegations, and they must be treated with the seriousness they deserve. The transcript described forced nudity, degrading treatment, sexual violence, the use of dogs in abuse, and systematic humiliation intended to break detainees psychologically. It also said that some of the victims were minors and that the patterns described were not isolated incidents, but part of a wider system. Those claims, if substantiated in full, would amount to severe violations of international humanitarian law and potentially crimes against humanity. It is essential to emphasize attribution here. These are allegations documented by human rights organizations and echoed in various testimonies and reports. They require independent investigation, preservation of evidence, and accountability mechanisms that credible international institutions should pursue without delay. The moral point, however, is straightforward. No state can invoke security and then ask the world to look away from credible evidence of torture or degrading treatment. If abuses are systematic, silence becomes complicity. This is also where the transcript made its sharpest argument about international hypocrisy. It asked where the United Nations is, where Western governments are, and why states that claim to defend rules-based order appear selective in the application of outrage. You do not have to accept every framing choice in the transcript to understand the underlying frustration. A rules-based order that applies only to enemies and never to allies ceases to look like order. It begins to look like hierarchy, and people across the region notice that difference with extraordinary clarity. So where does all of this leave us? On one level, the answer is simple and disturbing. Israel appears to be under greater pressure in southern Lebanon than its political class expected. Hezbollah appears more resilient and tactically adaptive than many planners assumed. The United States appears constrained, diplomatically exposed, and unable to produce a clean off-ramp with Iran. On another level, the answer is even more serious. Multiple fronts that were once discussed separately are beginning to merge into a single strategic crisis. Lebanon, Iran, maritime trade, energy inflation, Russian support, Israeli domestic confidence, and American political timing are no longer parallel stories. They are interacting parts of the same structure. That structure rewards patience, local knowledge, and asymmetry. It punishes arrogance, overextension, and the belief that superior firepower automatically creates political control. History is filled with powerful states that learned this too late. So here is the unasked question that now hangs over everything. Can Israel step back from a northern trap without appearing defeated? Can Washington pressure for de-escalation without admitting its limits? And can Iran continue to harden its position without pushing the entire region into a confrontation no one can truly contain? Those are not theoretical questions anymore. They are live strategic questions, and they are moving from the realm of commentary into the realm of consequences. Because somewhere in southern Lebanon, drones are still circling, artillery is still being repositioned, and men on all sides are still waiting for the next move. And somewhere between the hills of the border, the meeting rooms of Moscow, and the trading screens tracking oil, the central reality has become impossible to ignore. This is not a stabilized region. It is a region where battlefield setbacks, failed diplomacy, and moral collapse are feeding each other in real time. If the current trajectory continues, the next phase will not be defined by one spectacular headline. It will be defined by accumulation, more ambushes, more retaliatory strikes, more displaced families, more pressure on shipping lanes, more strain on governments that promised control and delivered uncertainty. That is why this moment matters more than many public briefings suggest. The danger is not only that one side misreads the other, the danger is that all sides keep reading escalation as leverage until leverage becomes disaster. For now, the most honest conclusion is also the most uncomfortable one. No one on this map seems to have a clean exit, and the people paying the price are not the men issuing declarations from podiums. They are the civilians in the villages, the conscripts in the armored crews, the detainees behind closed doors, and the families watching markets, sirens, and funerals rise together. That is the operational reality. And unless something changes very soon, this war of fronts, flags, drones, and failed negotiations is not narrowing, it is widening.